Of all the information in chapter 22 of your text, I thought that the part on the King James Version of the Bible was something that we should take time to look at closely. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about King James and this translation that was brought together by this king, James. James Stewart is actually his name. And before he was King James I, he was actually the King James of Scotland. Since King James I was very interested in religion, he ordered that the whole Bible should be carefully translated into English by the best scholars he could find at universities, Oxford, Cambridge, as well as Westminster. Altogether, 54 men were selected, and they were divided into 6 groups, each of which translated a certain part of the Bible. And when they had finished their work, they had the other groups kind of peer review and cross-examine the parts they had done, and were attempting to produce this authorized version, authorized by the king. And it was actually the translation of English speakers. I mean, for quite some time, even well into today, in the Protestant churches, the King James Version of the Bible is considered to be the most reliable translation. However, it's not actually probably the most accurate, and it's not the most reliable translation, and maybe some of those issues will be addressed here. Could go into great detail on some of the inconsistencies of the King James Version of the Bible, but really the part of the problem with the King James was at the time the manuscripts that they used from the original Greek and Hebrew were themselves a bit compromised. For example, Erasmus was the creator of the Greek text in the 1500s. He was a humanist, a friend of Martin Luther, and when he produced his Greek text, there were some parts that he didn't have manuscripts accessible to compile, and he kind of translated Latin Vulgate verses from Revelation into Greek, and all of that Greek collection becomes put into what is known as the Textus Receptus, which is Latin for basically the received text, or basically kind of a form of marketing and advertising to say, like, this is the good selection of Greek text manuscripts for the New Testament. Anyway, so there are a few discrepancies, and I'll probably address a few of them here as I keep going. But the 2 greatest influence on the shaping of the English language, hands down, are the works of William Shakespeare and the English translation of the Bible that appeared in 1611, the Authorized Version, the King James Version of the Bible. It was named for the British king, King James I, who ordered the production of a fresh translation in 1604. It's both a religious and literary classic. Literary scholars have heaped praise upon it endlessly, and 19th century writers and literary critics acclaimed it as the noblest monument of English prose. In fact, in a series of lectures at Cambridge University during the First World War, Sir Arthur Quiller Couch declared that the King James Bible was the very greatest literary achievement in the English language, and most people don't disagree with that. The King James Bible was a landmark in the history of the English language, and it inspired poets, dramatists, artists, and politicians. The influence of this work is incalculable. For many years, it was the only English translation of the Bible available, and without the King James Version, there would have been no Paradise Lost by Milton, there would have been no Pilgrim's Progress by Bunyan, Handel would have had no Messiah, there would have been no Negro Spirituals, and no Gettysburg Address. These and innumerable other works were inspired by this fine language of the Old English in the King James Version of the Bible. Without this Bible, the culture of the English-speaking world would have been immeasurably impoverished. The King James Version played no small part in shaping the English literary nationalism by asserting the supremacy of the English language as a means of conveying religious truths. The King James Bible is often referred to as the only masterpiece written by a committee. What is less often noted is that it drew on several existing translations, including the Geneva Bible and the work of William Tyndale, who was actually burned at the stake because he dared to translate the Bible. But his contribution, it was kind of used as footnotes in the translation process, his English translations, rather than begin the translation process from zero, from scratch. The King's Committee strove to make a good translation better, or out of many good ones, one principal good one. They chose a text that was both poetic and compact. In many cases, it revealed new layers of meaning. Key to their success was a sense of humility. Of course, they did not privilege their abilities above those who came before them. And these guys weren't, perfect. They were fallible. They were brilliant at the time, but there's been a lot of development since in the scholarly world, and even more manuscripts have been discovered since 1611 that date back even further than the manuscripts they had at hand at the time. So, though their judicious editing and dedication to the larger good, through their dedication, they produced a prayerful work of translation that endures to this day. However, the publication of the King James Bible in 1611 was not an unalloyed triumph of religion. A narrow set of Puritan and Roman Catholic scholars have always insisted that the Church of England was established primarily by force, imposed on a mostly reluctant nation by the government's power of pikes and scaffolds. But only over the past 20 years or so has popular awareness gained much sense of just how extreme the exercise of that power really was. And yet, if it wasn't the best translation or a genuine high point of the Christian faith, the book was a triumph in rhetoric, at least. In fact, the King James Bible remains the single greatest monument of the English language ever constructed. More than Milton, more than Shakespeare, more than Spencer, more than Chaucer, and the 50 or so scholars who worked from 1604 to 1611 managed a feat that's been unrivaled in English literature. They gave reality to the idea of a unified Great Britain by drawing together in a single tongue the separate nations of the islands. They gave America the vocabulary that would become the sole public idiom for the Protestants' New World. They established once and for all the rhythms of English rhetoric, the way the language wants to go, the repetitions and patterns into which, like traps, it always falls. The first copy of the King James Version of the Bible is thought to have been printed on May 5th, 1611. Officially, the King James Version of the Bible was a revision of also the Bishop's Bible, which was a reworking of the Great Bible, which drew on Miles Coverdale's efforts and John Rogers' editions, both of which came out of William Tyndale's translations, like we mentioned a second ago. Innumerable small and unannounced changes in wording, spelling, and punctuation followed over the years until Oxford's Benjamin Blayney established the modern text in 1769. So a lot of people will say, 1611 only is the only translation that we trust. But the truth is, probably what they really mean to say is the 1769 version of the King James Bible is the one they trust, because before 1769 there were a lot of errors, and not necessarily errors because the translators got it wrong, but the printing, which was actually a rather primitive form, but it was a modern technological advancement, as we discussed in chapter 19, that revolutionized the world, the movable type printing press, but there were still printer errors. And so some of these that have been changed, they were totally changed by the time the 1769 edition comes along, they're funny. So I'll tell you a few of them. One was that it said, printers have persecuted me, where it meant to say princes. And although the typos were surprisingly few for a 1,400-page book at that stage in the history of printing, the earlier editions were famous for their somewhat, maybe even intentional misprints. In one printing, it said, "Let the children first be killed." One edition explained it meant to say filled, not killed. "The Lord our God hath showed us glory for his great ass," in place of greatness, which is quite blasphemous, I suppose, according probably to people who are reading it, thought so. "The unrighteous shall inherit the kingdom." We know that's probably not accurate. I think it would be to say the righteous shall inherit the kingdom. And of course, the wicked Bible of 1631, which commands, "Thou shalt commit adultery," which would be totally contrary to saying "thou shalt not." Anyway, so the King James Version, basically, it was a major feat, a major task of scholars coming together and producing this pretty spectacular text that changed the world. It changed the English-speaking world absolutely outright. And it won. It arrived at the right moment of political history in England, and it was enforced by law during James' 22-year reign, and acceptable enough that it eased the worries of Protestants from the highest of high church Anglicans to the lowest of low church Puritans. But in all fairness, we must look a little bit at the life of King James. Like I said, his name was James Stuart. He was born in 1566. He first became King James VI of Scotland when he was at the ripe young age of 1 year old. 1 year, he was a 1 year old when he became king. But he probably didn't do very much in the earlier years. But James, as his history tells us, was actually a very unhappy child. He was lonely. His teachers bullied him. And just before Queen Elizabeth died in 1603 in England, she made it known that she wanted James to come be king. So James I was, in many ways, a highly successful king. This was despite some grave defects of character and judgment. He was the very reverse of Queen Elizabeth. He had a highly articulate, fully developed, and wholly consistent view of the nature of monarchy and of kingly power, and he wholly failed to live up to it. He was a major intellectual, writing theoretical works on government and engaging effectively in debate with leading Catholic polemicists on theological and political issues, as well as turning his mind and his pen to the ancient but still growing threat of witchcraft, and to the recent and menacing introduction of tobacco at the time. He believed that kings derived their authority directly from God and were answerable to God alone for the discharge of that trust, and that's where we get the divine right of kings concept there. This undistinguished, sometimes comical-looking man grew up in a loveless environment, they say, and his need to be loved was apparently strong in him. When, according to sources, when James was 13, an older and elegant French cousin arrived in Scotland, and the adolescent king fell in love with this cousin who was a man. So historically, there's pretty strong belief that King James was, in fact, bisexual, if not homosexual. In other matters, James gained political acumen. He was a quick study and had a retentive memory, but to this portrait must be added another brushstroke. As an adult, and especially in the last decade or so of his life, James apparently suffered from porphyria, which was a disease he inherited from his mother, and which he was passed along to the Hanoverians, where it would be responsible for the symptoms identified with the madness of George III. Porphyria means actually purple urine and refers to the most obvious sign of the ailment, which results from a pigment discoloration in the blood. The disease weakened and incapacitated James for periods of time, and it made him irritable and melancholy. According to some medical historians, James's need for close friends and favorites on whom he could depend on, whom he could delegate state business, and may be explained by his frequent bouts with this disease, rather than it was, something to do with the deficiency of his character. In any case, these diverse ingredients formed his character, and the result was a man who was a curious collage of self-confidence and self-indulgence housed in a less than glorious frame. James became a firm supporter of the Church of England and fought off all attempts by the Puritans to purge it of popish practices. He also tended to take a more tolerant attitude towards Catholicism. He felt sympathy toward the Catholic laity, but remained hostile toward the clergy, especially the Jesuits. This sympathy, plus his correspondence with the papacy, led English Catholics to believe that he would grant toleration. His failure to act resulted in a conspiracy to blow up Parliament. The gunpowder plot was discovered in November 1605. James retaliated with harsh action against the Catholic clergy and complicated his position with the English subjects and with the papacy by his advocacy of divine right kingship. This involved him in a pamphlet war with Cardinal Robert Bellarmine and developed in Parliament a suspicion of all his motives and actions that lasted throughout his reign. The divine right theory led him into conflict with his Chief Justice, the great advocate of the common law, Sir Edward Coke. His conflicts with Parliament were accentuated by his inability to judge men. So, the King James Bible, as we know it, came out under the authority of, not the greatest king or most moral king, maybe even that ever lived. He was blowing up Parliament. So, anyway, so there you have a glimpse at the King James Bible, its translation, how it's contributed to our literary understanding, and as far as the humanities are concerned, if something would take a position of being such a great work of rhetoric and such a great literary work of the English language, one can hardly ignore that as a humanities literary contribution. So there we have it, the King James Bible, also known as the Authorized Version, and King James I of England and his rule.